Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, which we set up in order to provide school boards and also superintendents with up-to-date information on 2021 annual meetings. I am Sue Siglowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association, and I'm joined today by Will Senning, who is the Director of the Elections Division for the Secretary of State's Office, and also JP Isabel, who is an attorney with the Elections Division of the Secretary of State's Office. And they are here to give you the latest information on changes that are currently moving quickly through the legislative process to facilitate safe elections during the pandemic, including authorizing school boards to move the date of their 2021 annual meetings and mail Australian ballots to all active registered voters. These changes are in a bill named H-48, which passed the House yesterday and is expected to be passed by the Senate without any changes and be signed by the governor within the next few days. There is a link to H-48 as passed by the House in the document that I mentioned that's in the handouts. Last week, the Joint Fiscal Committee allocated $2 million of the state's remaining federal CARES Act money to help school districts and other municipalities with expenses to print and mail ballots. And in addition to the changes that are in H-48, there are already some temporary changes to elections laws contained in Act 162, which was enacted in October of 2020, and Act 92, which was enacted in March of 2020. These changes are outlined in a school district meeting information sheet that the Vsba developed in collaboration with the Secretary of State's office. I'm going to summarize them very briefly now, and then we're going to devote the rest of the time to answering your questions. Under Vermont law, only a vote of the school district's voters allows a district to switch to an Australian ballot system. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Vermont Legislature passed Act 162, which allows school districts that normally vote from the floor at their annual and special meetings to instead use the Australian ballot method by vote of the school board. The temporary legislation allows any or all school district meetings to be conducted via Australia ballot in the year 2021. If the school board votes to use Australian ballot, an informational meeting is required by 17 VSA section 2680. Act 92, which is also linked in the handout, allows informational meetings to be held remotely. It is important to know that voting cannot occur in a remote meeting, so the Australian ballot method would need to be used for all articles. At this point, I'm going to ask Will Senning if he has anything to add to what the information that I just provided, and then we'll get into answering some questions. Will, do you have anything to add?
Well, Sue, yes, maybe. You nicely described just there the key provision in Act 162, allowing the legislative body to adopt Australian ballot. Would it be helpful for me to summarize what is in Act 48 that is potentially going to pass on Friday?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. As Sue said, this H-48, which is moving its way through the legislature quickly and passed the House on what, Monday or yesterday. The two key provisions in that proposed legislation are both permissive, not mandatory, but empower the legislative body, so in your case, the school board, to cancel the meeting and postpone it until a date later in the year. It also allows for, doesn't mandate, but permits the legislative body to choose to mail a ballot to all active registered voters. And there's an important distinction there that some folks get caught up on. So Act 162 authorized moving items from a floor meeting to an Australian ballot. But when you go to Australian ballot, the baseline, the standard system is a request-based system for absentee and early ballots, whereby voters have to request those ballots. So that's an intermediate step. You can say we're doing Australian balloting, but we're going to choose not to proactively mail a ballot to all of our voters, but instead rely on voters to make requests during the early voting period. Or, and if this legislation passes, you can take advantage of the authority that it will provide to then say, nope, we actually want to proactively mail a ballot to all of our voters. So those are sort of two different steps you can take. The third provision in that proposed bill, H48, provides authority to our office, to the Secretary of State's office, to implement temporary election processes related to these moves to Australian ballot and mailing of ballots due to COVID. And so when the legislation passes, you can expect pretty quickly thereafter for a directive to come from the Secretary of State's office with other additional processes that can be used for meetings this year. Some examples might include the ability to do drive-through polling places, outdoor polling places, and potentially the early processing of absentee ballots as they come in from voters. So I just want to quickly run through the potential provisions in H48 so that you know what is most likely going to be available to you by next week. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Will. We are going to now move on to some questions. We have some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, and we'll start with some of those. And then if you would like to, if you have a question and you'd like it to be addressed during the webinar, please type it into the question box and we will get to as many of those as we can. So the first question is, are we allowed to hold our annual meeting on March 1 as an in-person event? I'm not even sure if it's March 1, it might be actually March 2, but anyway. If so, could we offer a Zoom option for folks to watch from home?
So the first answer is yes. As of now, you're not prohibited from holding an in-person floor meeting, as they're referred to. If you do so, it is going to have to be in accordance with the current regulations from the governor's office in terms of the executive orders related to room capacity and social distancing. And generally, we refer folks to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and specifically Ted Brady, for the questions around those parameters, since they're changing all the time. So the answer is yes, you can. We and a lot of other state entities, VLCT, the administration, the Department of Health, are really strongly encouraging in-person meetings not to be held. That's why the ability to move to Australian ballot was provided. And we think it's important for folks to take advantage of those to avoid the health risks associated with in-person meetings. But yes, they're allowed. Second question is, could you provide a Zoom option to observe those meetings? I suppose technically the answer to that would be yes, that there could be a Zoom option for observation. There cannot be, however, any voting done by voters through a remote or virtual means for annual meeting. All the voting would have to be in person or by ballot.
Sort of a related question, Will, is has to do with whether they can limit the number of possible attendees at an in-person meeting.
And that's a no. I mean, if they're registered voters in your district, they have a right to attend. And that's the sticky wicket this year, of course.
Yes.
JP, always feel free to jump in and add anything to any of my answers as we're going here.
Next question is, if we postpone our annual meeting, do we have to specify a new date, such as, say, May 15th? Could we hold an in-person annual meeting at a later date in an outdoor venue?
So that first question is a good one. We knew that would be coming in. Reading the law, I do not read it to require that you announce the new date at the time you cancel the current meeting. I think that would be best practice. if at all possible, so that you don't leave your voters hanging and wondering whether and when the annual meeting is going to happen. But I don't think it's required right at that time. I would say try to figure it out and announce it and make it known as soon as possible. And keeping in mind that you're going to need a 30-day warning for that new annual meeting date when it comes. Can you remind me of the second question, Sue? Sorry.
One moment. Could we hold an
Oh, that's a
in-person
yes.
outdoor venue?
I mean, it depends, of course, on the state of the virus and the state of the executive orders at that time. But that's the point. That's sort of the purpose of allowing these meetings to be postponed. I see it as sort of a twofold purpose. That number one, the virus may be in a better state there where it is safe to hold an in-person meeting, or if not hold an in-person meeting inside, then have the time to plan and hold it outside, which is likely to be not now authorized, but likely to be authorized by our directive. I see the other purpose of allowing postponement just to be to get your processes in order. If you're adopting new processes like Australian balloting and or mailing a ballot to all of your voters, it gives you 2 months to put those processes in place and get prepared for it.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is there any possibility of warning some of our annual meeting articles by Australian ballot for the March 2nd election and holding others for a later date?
So not if you are taking advantage of this legislation and moving business that would traditionally be conducted by the floor to Australian ballot. We think the reading of the legislation and the VLCT is in agreement with us on this one. Means you either move all of the floor business or none of it. You can't sort of pick and choose items that you typically vote from the floor and put those on Australian ballot this year. The point again is to avoid the in-person meeting altogether. So you take all of the floor business and put it on Australian ballot. There are a few items that get voted on the floor often. I think this may be more true on the town side of things that don't necessarily translate to a ballot item. The one I'm thinking of, JP, is the accepting the reports of the town officers that sometimes appears on a floor meeting warning. And that, for instance, wouldn't need to be placed on the Australian ballot. But the point of the answer is you kind of can't pick and choose substantive articles to put on the ballot and ones to keep on the floor. Now, if as a standard matter, you conduct some of your business, for instance, your budget vote by Australian ballot, and then you have other business that you conduct from the floor, election of officers, et cetera. I think it may be possible, and we may authorize this in the directive, to do your Australian ballot business on March 2nd and move just the floor portion of your meeting to a later date in the spring. But again, that would be for towns where their existing structure has both of those things going on and they're not taking advantage of the law that's allowing them to move some stuff from the floor to the ballot where you're really meant to move it all and then conduct all of that balloting on one single date.
If we postpone our annual meeting, could we also postpone our intended budget deadline?
That one I'm not entirely clear on. I would assume yes. I don't know where that budget deadline exists, whether it's in statute or in the articles of agreement for the district where that question's coming from. I would want further follow-up on that one, Sue.
Okay. There's a little bit more information here, so I'm not sure if it's.
But I would assume yes, if that's referring to sort of an internal deadline, probably in the articles about when a board wants to have its proposed budget in place a certain amount in advance of the annual meeting, it would make sense to me that they could have that ready that same time in advance of the postponed meeting.
Okay, thanks. Next one, as our board officer seats are on the town ballots and not the school district ballot, I assume the board member elections would still occur on March 2nd, even if we were delaying our Unified Union School District annual meeting. As far as we know, all 6 of our towns are planning to stick with the March 2nd date and conduct all of their towns' annual meeting questions by Australian ballot.
I think that's correct, although that's a pretty nuanced question, particular to the type of district that's involved there. But what that's referring to is those of you who have members who are associated with, tied to a particular town, right? They're not your at-large members, and their legal opinions. And I don't know if this is based on language in articles of agreement or statute. JP could tell me maybe, but that the election of those board members that are tied to a town is actually a matter of business that's on the town ballots. Typically, like every year, they're voted under the town ballots and under the town warning. And in that case, I think those would stay with the town meeting timing. And so the answer to the question would be yes. Those would happen when the towns do their business, and the rest of the school district business would be later.
So in that case, someone who was running for school board would want to be sure to still get their candidate consent form into the clerk by January 25th. Is that right, Will?
For that town, yep.
Okay. Next
That's one I
question.
would
If we
probably
decide,
encourage you to talk about with your school district attorney also, and to follow up with us about for the union districts in that situation.
okay, thank you. Next question is, if we decide to stick with our March 1 and 2 annual meetings / voting dates, are we compelled to mail ballots to all voters or only those who request absentee ballots?
Not compelled to unless your school board votes to do so.
Okay.
And if they don't, then yes, on request.
Next question. In the case of mailing all ballots to voters, what is the recommendation? This is a considerable cost, both a monetary expense and significant time for the school district to administer. It would also put a significant burden on our town clerks if we ask them to manage this. And of course, we would of course be compensating them for the extra work.
And in which case, I would say that it's really dependent on the circumstances in your district and what you all think makes sense. It is the case that if you choose to mail a ballot to all your voters, the costs of doing so are borne by the school district. All the costs of the election are. And as you all are aware, I think there's widely varying degrees of willingness to assist with that ballot mailing for school districts among town clerks. And I think that's largely dependent on whether they typically do that or not. So a lot of you that conduct a lot of your business by Australian ballot already and coordinate with the clerks to include those ballots in their mailing of town ballots can continue to do that same coordination that you always do. The tough part is going to be for the school districts that typically do all or most of their business from the floor and are now asking the member town clerks and their boards of civil authority to assist with the ballot creation and early balloting processes, where the law is not clear that the clerk can be made responsible for that. Traditionally, I think most of them have taken on that work, but certainly we're already seeing across the state this year some tension between town clerks and BCAs that don't typically perform those functions for school districts being asked to this year. And that may be part of the consideration, frankly, whether you decide to do so or not.
Thanks, Will. You broke up a little at the beginning of the answer to your question, but I think we heard most of what you were saying. Related question, would all mail-in ballots be returned to the district offices? I'm assuming they mean the school district offices. And would the district clerk be responsible for tallying the vote on each article? What volunteers would we be authorized to enlist to help with mailing and vote counting?
I think, again, that's really dependent on the circumstances in the district. But JP, is there a clear answer about who the ballots are returned to? I think traditionally and typically they come back to the town clerks, who then proceed to either count them and provide the result in districts that don't commingle, or hold on to them and wait until election night and do the commingling on election night.
Right. I think that's what's traditionally happened in the past is those the towns would count the ballot, would process the ballots there on their at their polling place, and if they're not commingling, that town then sends the results to the school district. If they are commingling, that's when they get brought to the central location. So it probably does make sense for them to be returned to the town in that situation. But it does get back to your point about working together with the town clerks within your district and making sure everybody's on the same page for that process.
Because if you're mailing a ballot to all voters, that's going to be a significantly higher volume of ballots coming back for those clerks to process.
Thank you. So we'll move on now to some questions from our attendees. First question is, what is your guidance to school districts if one of the towns in its district decides to change the date of its town meeting and another does not?
Ultimately, your role is to decide the date of your meeting and the voting methods that your meeting will be conducted with. And I think if that doesn't align with every town's meeting in your district, then it just means those towns are going to be having to conduct two election processes. And you can't do anything about that. And that's another place where if you're in a situation like that, I hesitate to say it a little bit, depending on how many of these situations there are, but that's one we'd encourage you to contact us about. And we will do our best to be a liaison between superintendents, school boards, and the local clerks. Our office has a really good relationship with most of the clerks across the state, and we can do what we can to help facilitate that coordination.
Thank you. I'm sure that will be very helpful if needed. Next question is VSBA advocating for a common alternative date for those that might want to reschedule their annual meeting? It would seem like it would be in everyone's interest to approach this collectively rather than totally ad hoc. That's a great question. VSBA has not done that to date, but Will, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question and if you think that would be a good idea, what a alternative date would be.
I think we were meeting with the government operations committees back in December, even late November, to try and prepare for this bill. And in some of those really early discussions, I do think I threw out this suggestion at one point of what it sounds like that questioner is asking, which is, could we sort of move all annual meetings to one common date later in the spring? There are a lot of reasons why that would be easier and less confusing and less ad hoc. I think it also would have been a really tough sell in the legislature and to the towns and to all the municipalities across the state to try and find a uniform annual meeting date. And I think it wasn't entertained probably as something that would have taken too long to figure out and debate in the legislature. They really were trying to focus on the easiest provisions that would pass quickly because of the time frame involved. And I don't think it's not really practical to imagine going back and amending the legislation now to call for that.
Yeah, I think the question was not really about amending the legislation, but about whether VSBA should have a recommendation of a date that districts would move to so that it wouldn't be like a checkerboard, it would be more uniform.
And
if they follow the recommendation. Well, we'll keep you posted on that. Next question, how would an article to determine salaries, i.e. for board members, officers, etc., typically voted on by floor vote at annual meeting, be acted upon by Australian ballot?
JP, you got any help with that?
Yeah, it's instead of the question being asked from the floor, the question appears on the ballot. I could try and look back, but I know that there are examples of that in towns that already do their business by Australian ballot. It's simply, shall the district, I don't know how exactly it's worded, but, shall the district compensate board members, $1,000 a year or whatever the amount is, and then it's a yes or no question that does get asked by ballot.
There's just no debate and opportunity for amendment, but that's a good general answer here. When you're moving stuff from the floor to the ballot, you're putting the question on the ballot, and where it involves money, you have to come up with a number to put in front of the voters. Same thing goes for the budget.
Thank you. Next question. If ballots are being mailed on request, is it allowed to have our municipal clerks put our ballot in for all absentee requests? Do districts have the responsibility if they are contacted directly?
Yes is the basic answer about putting ballots in a single mailing. I would note that a person really is required to request a ballot for both elections, though. So you could have a town voter that has just requested their town ballot and doesn't want a school district ballot. And in those cases, the clerk would only send them the town ballot. But if they've put in a request for both, I think they can be mailed together if the timing is coordinated. And what was the last part? There was something else good there.
Do districts have the responsibility if contacted directly?
I would, if the district clerk gets contacted with a request, I would refer it to the relevant town clerk. Make sure that it gets to the clerk, or tell the voter to contact the clerk.
Okay, here's another one. If we do an informational only meeting electronically, can we omit the typical floor items for accepting reports of officers and setting the next annual meeting, or do we need to put these on the Australian ballot?
I think that's talking about where that floor business is combined with an informational meeting. They do the little bit of floor business and then go into the informational meeting. That gets back to what I was talking about early on, that I think hearing the reports of officers obviously doesn't make sense to go on a ballot because there's no meeting where those reports are being presented. But otherwise, it's sort of an article by article analysis. What was the other one? Oh, setting the next date of annual meeting. JP, I see you.
That might be a question I would run by the district attorney. I was under the impression that the date is set either within the Articles of Agreement or by state statute. So I didn't know that there are maybe districts out there that set it each year. So I need more information on that to try to look at what exactly they were doing there.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to see if there are any further questions. Yes, here's another one. We have a unified union district with multiple towns. If ballots are mailed, are they mailed with town ballots? Should we handle different decisions by town about, how should we handle different decisions by towns about mailing ballots?
That just harkens back essentially to what we've been talking about, but the message there, the important message there is it's always been our guidance, and I think it really has to be the case in accordance with the law, that all the voters in your district have the same opportunity in terms of early voting. So it either has to be that they're all being mailed a ballot or that they all have to request a ballot. And so you can't kind of go town by town through your member towns and have some going on a request-based model and others mailing. And that's where you get into these issues of a clerk and or BCA members not being willing to perform the mailing functions for you. And if there's a total impasse that can't be gotten past in that situation, you should call us for direct guidance to see next steps, I think. JP, I'm talking off the top of my head a little bit here, but I think due to the lack of clarity about the administration of the early ballot process in Title 16, I think there is room to say that if you could figure it out administratively to be administered by the district clerk's office, that it could be for those towns. If you had 5 towns mailing a ballot to all voters, and there's one who's holding out and says, we want to do request-based model. I think there's the potential, at least, to, for instance, get a checklist from that clerk of the district voters and perform the mailing from the district office and receive the ballots back at the district office. I think that's one potential solution. And then I think that's what the end of that question was getting at in terms of volunteers to perform those duties. That's where Title 16 is sort of lacking. There's no equivalent entity or body like the Board of Civil Authority in school districts that's responsible for conducting elections. Typically, it's just your elected clerk who in theory could do those duties, and we know that's not something they typically do. So again, talking sort of off the top of my head in the gray area, I think a best option, at least in that situation, would be to appoint voters of the district. The board could potentially appoint voters of the district as temporary election officials for the district to assist the clerk in administering the ballots for the one or two towns that don't want to do that. Any thoughts, JP? Am I going too far out on a ledge there?
My only thing was going to say is that I think our directive may also address the ability to use more flexibility to appoint election officials. I know in the general election, for instance, we said that an election official no longer had to be a registered voter within the town, for instance, and also extended that out to the 16 and 17-year-olds. They didn't necessarily need to live in the town, but could still work directly under an election official. So I'm assuming that our guidance was going to provide that flexibility again, so that would give districts more flexibility to appoint other people that they may need for elections assistance.
Okay.
Will and JP, when do you expect that guidance to come out of your office?
No later than sometime next week.
Okay, thank you.
We cannot issue it until the governor signs the bill, and that's probably going to be Friday, right. So early next week.
Next question. If you have an in-person meeting, state guidelines for space and distancing have to be followed, correct? So no more than 75 people indoors and 6-foot distancing?
I do believe 75 is the current maximum. There are some other parameters too. I think it's 1 per 100 square feet and 50% building capacity, but don't quote me on those. And I think 75 is also a blanket cover on all of those. And yes, you would have to comply with whatever they are at the time.
And Ted Brady is the person that you referenced earlier at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development that people could direct those type of questions to?
Yep.
Okay.
It also may be that the agency will issue further guidance. I would note that the AOE issued guidance regarding polling places and particularly using schools as polling places prior to both the August and November elections. And so it may be that we see further, more specific guidance for annual meetings also coming from that agency.
Okay, thanks. I have another question here. Will the timeline for the informational meeting be extended so that we can inform our voters about the budget before they send in their early absentee ballot? Currently, it cannot be more than 10 days before our Australian ballot.
I would say that the statute requires that one informational hearing occur within the 10 days of the vote, but nothing prevents you from holding more than one and holding them outside that time frame, so long as you do have that one that occurs within the statutory time frame.
Exactly.
Thank you. Another question. For a multi-town district where some towns are voting in March and others want to delay, how do we handle school district voting for those towns that intend to delay?
I think it's basically the same as my answer to a similar previous question. And it's good to keep re-emphasizing this, that at a bottom line, these are two different elections. And so you could still hold the school district election on March 2nd. And then you're asking that town that has delayed their town meeting to later in the year to help administer your school district meeting on March 2nd. There's a lot of, I think, misconception a lot of times for a lot of people, both general public and everybody, about those two things being somehow linked or the same meeting or needing to occur on the same day. And that's not the case. It's certainly easiest if that's the case, but.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah.
As a connected issue, I have received a few questions from school board members asking about whether votes could occur on different, for the school district budget, could occur on different dates for different towns. Do you have any feedback on that?
I don't think the law allows that at this point. And although JP can tell me if that's a legal provision, I think that they must all occur on the same date, voting taking place on the same day.
I just think from an elections perspective that
Yeah.
if the district is voting, then the district is voting that day. And it doesn't make a lot of sense that, well, one town could vote on this day, they may know the results on that day, and the other town says, well, we then have to wrap, it doesn't make sense from an elections administration perspective. They should really be held on the same day within the district so that all voters have the ability to vote and have their vote count that day.
Agreed.
Next question. How do we access the money intended to pay for mailing ballots?
Yeah, we're still ironing out the details of that, but as a general matter, you're going to apply to our office for reimbursement. So it's spend the money, keep track, keep receipts, and then at some point we will be providing a form that can be submitted to our office for reimbursement.
Okay, thank you. Next question, might the Secretary of State's office offer guidance on commingled ballots? Can there be an exception allowing them to be counted by town this year for less cohort interactions?
It makes a lot of sense, I would say. The typical commingling process where 2 or 3 people from every town at the end of the night come and get together in one room and count ballots is obviously dangerous given the circumstances. I think it's a wide variety of how those votes are processed across the school districts, depending on the articles of agreement. Some commingle, some don't. I would say that's to be determined whether there could be a blanket statement that those districts that typically commingle aren't required to this year. And that would be something I would want to consult, frankly, with you about, Sue, and the AOE before taking that step, whether we even have the authority to take that step by our directive or not. Having said all that, I've spoken with a lot of districts who are looking to take advantage of using a tabulator this year. And this gives me a good chance to sort of touch on that. Our advice there is our tabulators are so old that they aren't manufacturing them anymore, producing them. And the company has told us that they don't have enough, really any in stock to be providing temporary one-time use tabulators for these meetings. I had a few of those requests. So I encourage districts that are interested in it to talk to the town clerks in their district, figure out which town clerks use a tabulator and which ones might be using it on the meeting date. And there's the potential to program a card that could be inserted into those tabulators after the town ballots are counted in those towns to process the school district ballots. And in places where commingling is required, I've already said that given the circumstances, you could have the towns show up one by one, deliver their ballots, and run those ballots through the tabulator as they're delivered. And the towns don't have to stick around. Essentially, the tabulator does the commingling for you. As long as you don't put the ender card through and say, show me the result, you're not getting individual town results. You're just going to get the end after you've put all 5 or 6 towns through. So lacking any kind of blanket authority to not commingle when you're otherwise required to, one way to at least take the edge off of the time it takes and the people all in the same room commingling and counting is to use that tabulator method and just drop the ballots and leave. And JP, anything to add there, or if I'm off base?
I think people that have questions about commingling should contact us directly about that.
I think that's probably good advice.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is, what is the process for canceling the March 2nd annual meeting?
If authorized by the legislature, which it sure looks like it's going to be in this bill, it would be a vote of the school board. So recorded in the minutes, just like any other official action you take.
And I would just add again that if you are going to do that, spread that word so that voters are informed of that decision. Whether or not you have a date that you've set for the meeting, let them know, hey, there is actually not going to be a vote on March 2nd or whatever date you're postponing it from. So really try to communicate that, get it out to the clerks, get it out to your voters, front porch forum, those types of things.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. If voting on a moderator, treasurer, and clerk that would normally be on the floor, but now on Australian ballot, does that require a separate article for each position? Or if you only have one person for each position, could they be combined on one article?
I would do a separate article for each position.
And I would just add, because technically you would need to have a write-in spot, even though there's only one person running, you would still need a write-in spot for that. And if you put them all together, someone might not want to serve in all three. They might want to serve in just one of those positions, technically.
Actually, that's a good place to touch on something else, Sue, that for those of you like that question, right, where you're moving business that's usually on the floor to Australian ballot this year, pursuant to Act 162. And in that case, where you're moving the election of officers, of humans, just to note that where those nominations typically take place from the floor at a floor meeting, you get the nominations or the people who are going to be running for those positions on the ballot through the filing of consent forms. And those consent forms are due by the statute by the 6th Monday before the meeting, which for the March 2nd meetings is January 25th. But I wanted to point out there's language tucked into 162 that says if you're doing this, if you're converting to Australian ballot from floor business, that our office can waive deadlines associated with that Australian ballot process. And honestly, that candidate filing deadline is one of the typical ones because it's so far out, 6 weeks before the election, that you may find you want to have waived and moved closer to the election day. And if you're doing that, it's just that you need to make sure you have that filing deadline for candidates enough in advance of the election to prepare the ballot 20 days before. And so I could envision like a 30-day before deadline for candidates for those offices, waived from the 6 Mondays before the meeting, which is the standard law.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is there a sample warning which shows how to include matters that are typically handled in person to be voted on by the AB, Australian ballot?
JP, we still have decent ones on our website?
We don't have warnings with articles on them. You could certainly contact us with that, but I would suggest looking back at what was warned last year, for this, and the question that was asked from the floor is now asked by ballot instead. So you just move that question or that article or that candidacy to the ballot.
But we do have sample warnings for Australian ballot meetings. Like JP said, they don't have the articles, sample articles and the model articles in them. but that question might have been about sort of how you phrase just the general warning too. And that's where instead of talking about a meeting date, you define the polling place and the polling hours that people can come and vote.
And we do have those samples on our website.
Yep.
And we could add those to the document that contains a bunch of links. We could send that out to everybody when we send the recording of this. Next question is, I chair a regional school board serving 9 towns. It seems that some could choose to stick with the normal town meeting date. Some could choose a later date of May 1, and others could choose June 1. Thus, we could have a school board budget vote and election that would stretch over 3 months. Is that legal? It seems fraught with problems.
No, you wouldn't. And that's, I mean, we've touched on that now a couple times. It's the towns are voting on when they're holding their town meetings. And that doesn't necessarily move the date that they administer your meeting. You set the date of your meeting. And then it's a matter of telling those towns, hey, the school district meeting is happening on this date. I see you've moved yours. We're going to need a polling place on this date in your town.
Okay, next question. How many days prior to the Australian ballot election does the informational meeting have to be held?
And that's within 10 days. So anytime within the 10 days preceding.
Okay, here's another
And
one.
I don't know if we've touched on yet, Sue, I think you did maybe in the initial guidance document, but just a reminder that those informational meetings can be conducted virtually because they're considered a meeting of the school board. They're hosted by the school board. And under the emergency provisions in the open meeting law, they can be done remotely, and you don't actually even need to have a physical location. For voters who don't have broadband internet access in those situations, what the legislature provided is that you have to have a conference call ability so that they can at least call into the virtual meeting by their landline.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. If some towns in our district delay their votes and the school vote were to follow suit, one would assume that we might not know the outcome of voting until the latest date. If the budget were not to pass, would that not make it difficult to have a second vote in a timely way?
Same answer. You're not splitting up your school district election over the course of dates of these town meetings. You set the date of your meeting. I know it's easy for me to say. I understand the practical issues. I really do. But
yeah. Another question, did Will say that accepting the reports should not be on the Australian ballot? Our moderator, who is the town attorney, told us it needs to be on the ballot.
JP, do you think I'm off base there? I follow the advice of your district attorney if they think it should be. I don't know what you're voting on there if there are no reports to accept.
I concur with Will. I can say as well that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns has said that voting, even in the past, even before COVID, that it's not necessary to have those quote unquote approved by the voters. It's not something that's in statute. It's a tradition that's been done for a very long time, especially from the floor. And I am not aware, I haven't seen it on an Australian ballot before for towns that have traditionally done Australian ballot votes.
I haven't either. Yep.
Okay, next question. We have 5 towns who we work with for voting. We have 2 towns who intend to send ballots to every registered voter and 2 towns who are only sending ballots to the people who request them. There is concern about equity to the voters if only 2 towns are sending to all voters. The school board is concerned that if the school board votes to send out ballots to all voters, there may be confusion by the voters as they are receiving only the school ballot separate from the town. How do we ensure a fair and accurate voting process?
It's really the same question again, right, that we've been dealing with. And I knew this. I'm not surprised that these are the questions because this is the hard part. It's your union districts trying to coordinate with the member towns so that their elections, one, are happening on the same day, and 2 are happening by the same early voting method. And so it's kind of the same answer to both. In that situation, this person seems to understand it's up to the school board to decide their method. It's not a problem legally for all of the school district ballots to be proactively mailed to voters, where the individual town ballots among the member towns may or may not be, because again, those are 2 separate elections. So there can be distinctions between your member towns and how voters are getting their town ballots, but there can't be among all of your district voters a difference. And so it would lead to the situation that questioner is describing, where everybody might get sent a school ballot, and then in 2 of the towns, everybody also gets sent a town ballot, and in the other 2 towns, people need to request the town ballot. That legally is okay, even though it will cause voter confusion for sure. And then you're back in the question of whether the school district itself is doing the ballot mailing for the 2 towns that aren't proactively mailing their town ballots out. And that's where we were talking before about the clerk taking on that process, potentially with volunteers appointed by the school board and a checklist provided by those towns. But you know, my first line of advice there is let's try to, sorry, Sue, let's try to work with you, those towns in our office, to find a solution where they can all be doing the same method and helping you with it.
Okay, thanks, Will. Another question. If even one town in a multi-town district chooses to postpone its meeting later than May 31st, how could the school district hold a revote before the June 30th deadline for either passing a budget or being able to spend only 7% of the prior budget? This assumes we don't ask the town clerks to hold a vote only for the school district on the normal March date.
It's the same answer again. You know, they're asking about, they're implying that the one town that has moved its meeting is going to delay their ability to hold a meeting earlier than that. And it's again that if you're concerned about that June 31st deadline, you set your school district meeting whenever you think it needs to be set to meet that deadline. I would, and I don't want to get over my skis here, which I want to do, but it's my understanding, at least, and Sue, you can maybe help correct me if I'm wrong here or not, but the June 31st is not a hard deadline for school districts to have a budget in place. It is that if they do not have a budget in place by that date, they have the authority to borrow certain amounts after that date to continue business. But they have to still at that time keep attempting to adopt a budget for the upcoming year. It's not as if that's a hard deadline for adopting a budget, and after that date you're tied to a certain amount, which I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around. You're then authorized to borrow a certain amount, but you still need to keep trying to adopt a budget. Is that your
That's
understanding?
correct, Will.
Too? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Here's another one. We're getting close. We only have about 5 minutes left. Hopefully we can get to everyone's questions. They keep coming in. Typically, our annual town report mailed out ahead of town meeting includes both town and school district budgets / information. If the school district opts to hold annual meeting using Australian ballot and the town opts to delay town meeting, will / should the annual town report include both the town and school district budgets, or will the school district need to publish its own town report ahead of the March 2nd meeting?
I'd defer to JP, but my answer would be, number one, the only thing that's required to be in the town report is the report of the auditors. So as a legal matter, you shouldn't get too bent out of shape. And some other stuff, JP shakes his head at me a little bit there. You shouldn't get too bent out of shape about what is or isn't in the town report. I understand the question though. And I would say, yeah, get out your own information about your budget to all the voters in advance of the March 2nd meeting and let the town worry about the town report later in the spring in advance of their meeting.
Sorry, my dog is barking, but I believe, and I didn't look at this before the meeting, but there is there's a requirement for the school district to provide a report as well. And
Okay.
traditionally what has happened in the past is because town and school districts were the same, they've always included them within the town report. Because of all these changes to the mergers and whatnot, I think that process has become a little bit harder to include in the town reports. And so I do believe that the intent was to have the two separate reports. And so trying to coordinate with the town may be difficult.
Safest bet would be to get your report out before your meeting.
Okay, thank you. How does the warning for town meeting change to include Zoom meeting information and not a physical location?
There are definitely some sample warnings about warning a virtual meeting. It's a time to remember and point out, though, that the actual annual meeting itself cannot be done virtually. So the meeting warning is not going to refer to any virtual meeting. A lot of times, though, in the meeting warning, they'll also include notice of the informational meeting, which can be done virtually. And then I think VLCT has some of the best sample language about warning a virtual meeting for public bodies. And I know you all aren't members of VLCT, but you can access those resources on their website.
Okay,
JP,
thank
anything
you.
else?
Next question. If we normally elect a moderator from the floor along with treasurer, clerk, etc., should we also move the moderator to Australian ballot with the clerk and the treasurer, or is the moderator not required until there is an in-person meeting?
No, yes, you should put the moderator election on the Australian ballot. It's a required officer. You have to elect him every year, him or her every year. And even though they may not have any meetings to run this year, you still elect the position. And it may well be that later in the year, there's a need for a special meeting that is conducted by the floor, and then you would need a moderator.
Okay, next question. If a town defers their meeting to a later date and the school district goes forward with Australian ballot vote for March 2nd, would the publication of an annual report need to be two separate documents? Who is responsible for completion and publication cost of the report?
That's what we were just talking about, right? And so, yes, I think it would be two separate documents. And JP, correct me again, but the school district would be responsible for making the school report and distributing it.
That's right, correct, yep.
Okay, next, is the candidate consent form that we are using for school board elections valid for other elected positions such as school district clerk?
Yes, there's the sample that's on our website includes a spot where you can put in the position, so you can put moderator, clerk there. So yes.
Okay, next question. As a technical center school district, our district includes 3 school districts and 10 towns. Does the legislation intend all of these entities to coordinate a single date and types of voting, in-person or mail-in ballots? We have towns in our district already making decisions about dates and ballots.
Yeah, that's another layer, isn't it? So that's a district on top of a couple union districts, as I understand it. I would encourage this person to contact us, but it's the same messaging that I've been giving, throughout this session, which is that your meeting date is your meeting date. But that certainly presents a whole other layer of complexity. I'm not very familiar with how those regional tech centers work, so I would want to speak to the individual circumstances of that.
Okay, what is the best way for people to contact you, Will?
Email.
Email? Okay. And we'll provide Will's email when we do a follow-up email to all of the attendees.
And JP's.
Next question. Right, and JP's too.
Sue, I have a
If the
pretty
board-
hard stop at 1. I'm sorry to say, but I can do a couple
Okay.
more minutes, but I have to be going.
Okay, All right, I've got, it looks, I can't tell how many more I have, but we'll keep going until, for just a
We're
couple more
happy to
minutes.
we're happy to take these questions later and send answers out en masse too.
Okay, great. So if there's others that we weren't able to get to, we'll answer them. If the board is conducting a Zoom informational meeting, well, what specific language should be in the warning? Should the specific information for the Zoom meeting, internet link and phone number be included on the warning itself?
I think yes is the answer. All the ones I've seen have as much information as possible about how to access that meeting. JP.
What I would say is that these informational meetings are just like board meetings. So if you've been
Yep.
conducting your board meetings by Zoom, any information on that should be included with the warning for access to that Zoom meeting.
Okay, this is going to be our last question that we'll answer live. Are school districts municipal legislative bodies, that's in quotes, municipal legislative bodies, under section 2A2 of H48, so they can require town clerks to mail school district ballots?
They are municipalities. I'm looking at the language. Yeah, you know what's interesting? Oh. No, the way I read that language in section A2 is that the municipal clerk being referred to there is actually the school district clerk. Although we all know that's not the way that it works as a practical matter, but the municipal clerk for the school district is the clerk of that municipality, which is your school district clerk. So you technically say to your clerk, we're mailing a ballot to all voters, and then you go about the real business of coordinating with all the town clerks to actually do it.
Okay, thank you, that's
But that,
helpful.
and that's a good question, and it's important to note, because I know that the legislature wouldn't have intended to allow a school board to mandate action by a town clerk.
I don't know if this is a good area to right now, but I just wanted to plug, if you don't mind, Will and Sue, that we have been working on an updated statute with more elections guidance, which is sorely lacking in the education statute. And certainly COVID has kind of put that in the back burner, on the back burner, and we're trying to deal with what the situation is now. But these issues were there, some of these issues were there before, and the statutes really need to be addressed. And we've been working on that, and so hopefully the legislature will take that up this year and provide more guidance and clarity in the statute on a lot of these questions.
And we've been working on it with AOE, with the attorneys from AOE, and with a number of school district attorneys around the state too. So not just from the elections perspective, but those entities have been working together to try and come up with a law that makes more sense.
Yes, it'll be great when that finally happens. I think this is a perfect place for us to end. I'm sorry we did not get to all of the questions, but as I said, we'll compile the remaining questions and I will send them to Will and JP, and then we'll get the answers out to everybody who registered for the webinar. We certainly hope that this has been helpful for everyone. We will also provide Will and JP's email addresses when we get back to all of you with an email, so that you'll be able to contact them if you have further questions. Will and JP, we thank you so much for dedicating more than an hour to answering all of these questions.